Here are three intriguing true crime stories where perpetrators altered the victim's clothing to mislead investigators and confuse the crime scene. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey. In December 1996, 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado. Her murder remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. JonBenét was discovered with a garrote around her neck, duct tape over her mouth, and her wrists bound. She was dressed in different clothing than what her parents reported she had been wearing when she was put to bed. The alteration of JonBenét's clothing suggested that the perpetrator had changed her clothes to mislead investigators about the timeline of the crime and possibly the location of the murder. The presence of undisturbed fibers from different clothing on her body further confused the investigation. Despite extensive investigation and numerous theories, JonBenét's killer has never been identified. The change in her clothing remains one of the many perplexing aspects of the case, contributing to the myriad of theories about what happened that night. The murder of Rebecca Zahau. In July 2011, Rebecca Zahau was found hanging from a balcony at the Spreckels mansion in Coronado, California. Her death was initially ruled a suicide, but many, including her family, believed she was murdered. Rebecca was found nude, with her hands and feet bound and a gag in her mouth. Her clothing was found nearby, but she was not wearing it when discovered. The fact that Rebecca was found nude and the positioning of the bindings led to speculation that her clothing had been removed and the scene staged to look like a suicide. The lack of clothing was unusual and suggested an attempt to mislead investigators about the circumstances of her death. The investigation was controversial and inconclusive. In 2018, a civil jury found Adam Shacknai, the brother of Rebecca's boyfriend, liable for her death in a wrongful death lawsuit, though no criminal charges were filed. The alteration of her clothing remains a key point of contention in discussions about whether her death was a suicide or a homicide. In May 2001, Chandra Levy, a 24-year-old intern at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, went missing in Washington, D.C. Her remains were discovered in Rock Creek Park over a year later. Chandra's skeletal remains were found scattered in the park, with some clothing items located away from her body. The positioning and state of her clothing suggested foul play. The discovery of Chandra's clothing away from her remains led investigators to believe her clothing had been altered or removed to mislead investigators about the circumstances of her death. The staged scene suggested an attempt to confuse the investigation by obscuring the manner and timing of her death. In 2010, Ingmar Guandique, already serving time for other crimes, was convicted of Chandra's murder based on circumstantial evidence and a jailhouse informant's testimony. However, his conviction was later overturned, and charges were dropped in 2016 due to lack of evidence. The alteration of Chandra's clothing and the staged crime scene continue to raise questions about the true circumstances of her death. These cases illustrate how altering a victim's clothing can be a deliberate tactic to mislead investigators, complicate the crime scene, and obscure the truth behind the crime.